All right, welcome to another episode of On the Record, where we sit down with professional musicians and talk to them about how they have found success in this crazy business that we call music. Today, I'm really excited to sit down with someone who I think we could describe equally as a master guitar player, a master songwriter and singer, but also a wonderful author, a wonderful music historian, guitar historian, and I think we could probably go for days to describe, what it is that you do. So maybe the best thing we could do is just thank Mr. Deke Dickerson for joining us.
Thanks for having me on here. Glad to
Thank
be
you.
here.
And we'll just jump right in.
Sure.
So I typically start these interviews by asking the subject some form of this question, which is, could you describe for us the best that you could what a normal workday looks like for you? Outright.
Well, when you asked me to do this and you mentioned, how to make a focus was how to make a living as a professional guitar player, the first thing that I thought of is, man, I play guitar, but in reality, it's like I sort of learned real early on that it was a DIY operation. It was like, man, I was going to have to not only learn how to play guitar, but also to sing, play a bunch of other instruments, lead a band, drive the van, get paid, learn how to record everything, learn how to put together promotional pictures and album covers, and basically just kind of do the whole dang thing myself. So I don't have a typical day. Sure. is what I'm getting around to. It's always like I've got a to-do list that I start with at the beginning of the day. And, it might involve booking some shows. It might involve doing some recording. It might involve doing a gig. It might involve 100 different things. But every day is different, which is nice. It's kind of exciting. Even after all these years, I don't have like a 9 to 5 where I just go do the same thing all day. But it's kind of crazy.
Sure. So I think maybe building off of that a little bit, you mentioned a few things that you sometimes typically do. But I think maybe if we just start by describing to the best that we could, what your business model looks like, specifically maybe some areas that you have found success in the past or recently, with regard to, kind of how your business actually works.
Right. So, I'm in my early 50s, and I know that you've talked to Red Volkart, who's older than me, and Brent Mason, who's older than me. And, we sort of came from a time where you could actually make a comfortable living just doing guitar gigs. Sure. You know what I mean? Like you could work, and that still kind of exists in places like Austin and, Portland, Nashville. There's a few towns where you can actually do that. But for the most part, that went away a long time ago. But when I first started playing guitar as a, 13-year-old kid, you could get work all the time. I mean, it was just live music was happening. People went out multiple days a week. The shows were packed every night of the week. And when that sort of began to wane, you had to figure out other ways of making money. And so for me, I realized that, I was going to have to be a jack of all trades if I wanted to avoid a day job. And that's the number one thing is my motivation in life was to avoid a day job. Because I had a day job and I couldn't stand it. I just wanted to be my own boss and figure out how to do this on my own. So, I got into writing. I was always really interested in the recording process, initially because I was so unhappy with how every time that I went in the studio, it just didn't sound the way I wanted it to sound. I liked these old records and I couldn't get it to sound like that. So I got involved in recording studio stuff and I learned how to do that. And just a whole bunch of other ways that I sort of have juggled to keep it all afloat, to keep some money coming in and avoid the day job.
Absolutely. So you touched on a few things that I'm going to follow up on, including the recording and the writing. Mm-hmm. But before we get there, you also mentioned Brent, you mentioned Red. A lot of the people who I sit down with for these interviews, they might have maybe one one path, and then probably a lot of other side things that help supplement,
Right.
that primary path. But from the outside looking in with what you do, it seems like you have equal hands in different pots. And I was wondering if that was just the perception and if that wasn't actually reality, or if, with you described yourself as jack of all trades. Is that really, if you say, my name is Deke Dickerson and I am blank, what is that?
Well, and that's the thing is it's like the most schizophrenic resume you could possibly imagine. Some people, they just come up and they say, oh, you're that guitar player guy. And, other people come up and they say, oh, you're that singer guy. And other people come up and they say, oh, you're that writer guy I know from Guitar Player magazine and, vintage guitar and whatever else. And so I don't really spend a whole lot of time thinking about, how people are going to perceive me or any of that. I literally am just thinking, okay, well, now I have to do X and tomorrow I'm going to be doing Y, and it's all got to have money continually rolling in, even if it's a small paycheck or a big paycheck. Don't do anything that's going to lose money or do it for free. And so it just winds up being a whole bunch of varied stuff. And sure, there's not really any plan to it. It's just kind of how it works.
Well, so the way that you describe it, today I'm doing this, tomorrow I'm doing that, you seem like a very project-oriented person.
Sure.
Looking at your schizophrenic resume a little bit, can we jump into some of those different projects
Sure,
that you're working on right now and that you've done in the past that you have found to be positive for your career?
Sure.
Let's start with the recording. Mm-hmm. So you have work that is kind of all over the map in terms of where it's been featured in films, amusement parks, and of course your own work and other people's work. Can you kind of describe a little bit about how you found yourself doing? I guess in certain sense it's traditional session work, and in other senses it's this alternate type of session work.
Yeah, I would call it alternate session work because, like I said, when I first started, and you're going to these recording studios, and you're looking for a certain sound, you're going in there thinking, I want this to sound like a Carl Perkins record, and then they record it like a Steely Dan record, and I was like, man, this is not what I'm trying to achieve. And so when I moved to California in the early 90s, there was a couple of guys, a guy named Wally Hersom who played with Big Sandy and the Fly Ride Boys, and then also a guy in San Diego named Mark Neal who had vintage style recording studios. And this, greatly intrigued me. I had to know like how they were doing it, and I recorded at both of their places, and I kind of watched and observed, and then I started trying to do it myself, and the first results were really pitiful. I listen to them now, I'm like, wow, that's really bad. But it's just like anything, like learning to play the guitar. You gotta stink before you can achieve any sort of professional results. And it's taken a really long time, but now I'm to the point where I can record something in my house that gets released by a Paramount film and is shown in theaters all across the country. And it's pretty wild, to go to a theater and here's this thing you recorded at your house, like booming out of the speakers.
Well, when you say vintage style recording studio, is that what you have at your house, or do you work on sort of a hybrid system?
It's sort of a hybrid system because, I started out wanting to do just all analog, like the 1950s, and I did a fair amount of that. And I really like doing that if you have really good musicians with really good instruments and songs and everybody's prepared. The problem is nobody's like that anymore. That's like another thing that's just lost. So you get a lot of bands who would come to my studio and they would say, yeah, we want to do it live to tape like the old days. And I'd say, okay. And then we'd start recording and they say, well, now when I overdub the solo, I'm like, no, you don't understand. We just recorded that live to mono tape. It's done.
Right. That's it.
You're finished. And they're like, oh, well, no, wait a minute. We got to redo the vocals and the lead guitar and the bass made a mistake. And I'm like, yeah. So eventually I sort of acquiesced and got into digital recording and Pro Tools and all that. And at first I was kind of horrified that I was getting into digital recording, but the stuff they have now, it sounds so good. You know, I use a Universal Audio Apollo setup, and all their plugins sound really good, and I have no problem with it. You know, I kind of go back and forth between vintage microphones and vintage preamps and a few things like EQs and compressors that are in, you know, rack mounted things, and then using a bunch of plugins too. You know, I just kind of go with whatever sounds good to my ears.
That's awesome. You mentioned featured on a Paramount film. Um, you know, I know that one of the things that you do is you work on scores and sort of soundtrack type style stuff. And I was just wondering if you could maybe walk us through a little bit how that process differs from what would most musicians would consider to be a normal recording session.
Well, you know, my experience, most of my movie stuff has been Johnny Knoxville related, you know, because he's asked me to do a bunch of different movies. But I have done stuff for, well, I had a song in that movie Sideways, which started as a small independent film and then wound up winning best picture of the year. But then a bunch of things on like HBO and Cinemax and, you know, those kind of cable TV show type things. And they're all kind of different. You know, sometimes they'll just approach you and say, we have this song on one of your CDs and we want to license it. You know, that's easy. That's fine. Yeah. That's easy. And then, you know, with Johnny Knoxville, it's usually like he'll text me and say, hey, are you in town? And I'll say, yes. And he'll say, okay, we need something that sounds like this by Tuesday. And you know, it'll be like Friday or something. So then I'll just immediately jump in the studio and try to come up with a couple of variations on a theme and see what he likes, and then just try to make something happen very, very, very fast. Because he's, you know, the way that he works is really sort of like just off the cuff, and everything's got to be done right away. And I don't know if there's other people in Hollywood that work that way, but I've sort of gotten used to working with him, so I know what to expect.
Well, that's awesome. That's really, really neat. So
keeps you on your toes.
Right.
You know, because, you know, I might be playing a country thing 1 second, and then the next second he'll want something that's like, you know, sort of a heavy metal thing, or like a, you know,
punk rock.
Yeah, punk rock. It really varies.
That's very, very cool. So you also mentioned people coming to your studio and recording. Do you still take work as sort of a producer engineer role, or is that's still something you actively do?
I haven't had any bands in. I've had one client in there since COVID, and you know, it was, you know, one of those things where we made sure everybody was triple vaxxed and we were very cautious. But I basically haven't recorded any bands since COVID. But a lot of people, probably half a dozen projects, have sent in things that they wanted me to mix or to master for them and stuff like that. And I love doing that because you can do it on your own time, you know.
Sure, absolutely. Well, let's shift a little bit to you as a working musician.
Sure.
You as, I guess, more the Deke Dickerson, the guitar player, songwriter, and performer. Shows are coming back. You've had a string of shows that you've done. We're here in Atlanta right now.
That's right.
You've got one coming up, and you've got a series of shows, I think, through the summer and maybe into fall at this point.
Well, you know, working on it. It's weird because it's kind of comes and goes, you know, like it'll come on real strong and then another variant will come in and everything will kind of get put on hold. And so I had a bunch of shows in February, but then like March and April I have hardly anything because back when Omicron came in, everybody was like, let's put the brakes on this for a while. But then, you know, I've got stuff coming up in the summer and festivals overseas, and so we'll just see how it all goes. Sure. I think we're all just kind of waiting to see if there's going to be another variant come along that shuts everything down again, or if we can just kind of go ahead with it.
Sure. Well, one thing that I wanted to sort of ask you about your touring style, I think a lot of people who don't do this think of a performer as someone who travels with their band from show to show and, you know, plays with a consistent group of guys, and you play with a consistent group of people, but it's more of a regional, I don't want to say pickup band because they're not a pickup band necessarily, but
Right.
you work with different groups as you go around the country and you go around the world. Could you kind of explain that a little bit and describe, sort of the why? Is that a business decision? Is that an artistic
Sure.
decision?
Well, for years, I did have my own band, and we toured around in a van, and we did these tours that lasted for, 4 to 6, 7 weeks sometimes, just going everywhere, playing every single night of the week. And I love doing that. But, it just sort of got harder and harder and harder to like, okay, we got to book Tuesday night in Fort Wayne, Indiana. There's nowhere to play, like nobody's going out on a Tuesday night in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And so the business model sort of changed. And by the time that the business model changed, I had met all these incredible musicians, and not just in America, but all over the world. And so it sort of turned into this thing where, oh, well, if I'm doing some shows in Holland, I know some really good musicians there I can work with. If I'm doing some shows in Australia, I know some really good musicians there I can work with. If I'm doing some shows up in Seattle, I know some really great musicians in the Pacific Northwest I can work with. So I've done that a whole bunch of different times, and I'm doing it right now where I work with sort of a local act and do a weekend or a week's worth of shows and then just fly home. And it works out better financially for everybody in the end because you don't have to pay for as many plane tickets and hotels and all that kind of stuff.
Sure. Can you kind of describe how that changes your approach, or if it changes your approach to the music itself?
So, there are certain artists that are like, okay, this has to sound like the record every single time, and they just try to whip whatever pickup band they're working with into making it sound like my record, And for me, I kind of realized early on, it was like, okay, so I'm going to be performing with all these different musicians. Let's try to analyze what they're good at and what they're not as strong at, because some groups you work with, they all sing harmonies. Okay, let's do a whole bunch of songs where everybody's singing harmonies because that's great. And some guys are like real kind of sloppy punk rock players. It's like, well, we're not really going to do the country songs here. We're going to concentrate on, let's do some surf songs and some sloppy rock and roll and have a good time.
Sure.
And, I think it's better if you just sort of take stock of the players that you're working with and try to figure out what's going to make the best show.
Sure. Sticking with the music for a minute, I want to shift gears, but not so much, and just talk about your philosophy to the music itself, because I think when a lot of people describe you, they use the word, oh, he's the real deal, or he's a purist. And I was just wondering how you might respond to someone calling you a music purist, how you feel about that, and if there's like a music stewardship that you feel with regard to keeping things pure. I've used that word several times, and I'll turn it over to you and ask you how you feel about that.
Well, I don't think I'm a purist so much. There are certain guys that play rockabilly or vintage country or whatever, and to them it's almost like a cosplay kind of a thing. Like, we're going to wear the clothes, and we're going to do the hair, and we're going to have the instruments, and we're going to play the songs exactly like it was on July 14th, 1956. You know what I mean? And some of those acts are real good. I mean, I'm not putting them down. I have been thoroughly entertained by some of those bands. But for me, it's always like, man, I really love this doo-wop record, and I really love this surf record, and I really love Gene Vincent and the Blue Caps, and I really love Little Richard, and I really love Merle Travis. And I just have always been so obsessed with all these different kinds of music that all happen to be of a certain era, definitely sort of pre-hippie era, I guess is the term to use. Okay. That's just the music I want to play. And so when I sit down to do a show, it's like, man, I'm writing original songs. I'm doing some obscure covers, but I want them to have the same impact as Buddy Holly or, any of these other heroes of mine that have long passed. Sure. So for me, it's not so much a cosplay thing as it is just or a purist thing, so much as it is, that's what I like, man,
I'm going to steal that term, the cosplay thing. I like that. I think that's great.
Well, it's funny because, I love vintage clothes and I love old guitars too.
Sure.
But man, like we all have to be aware, like
It's
we are in the
2022.
we are
Right.
living in the modern era and we're doing a vintage style of music.
Right. Deke Dickerson records on Pro Tools, guys.
Yeah, it's true.
Well, I think that is maybe an opportunity for us to segue a little bit to
Right.
talk about some of your other roles. This is a term that I would use to describe you, which is a kind of a, music historian or guitar historian / author. And, I wanted to start by talking about a project that you have coming out soon that I'm very excited about, being a thumb style player myself, the Merle Travis biography.
Yep.
Could we start by talking specifically about that project, and then we'll expand a little bit into your authorship over the years, both as a columnist and article writer, as well
Sure.
as a book author?
Well, I'm really excited about the Merle Travis book too, and not only because I worked on it for almost 4 years, and then it's been delayed for almost 2 years with the COVID thing. It's finally going to be coming out in May of this year, and it was kind of touch and go because my publisher, I know that they've canceled some of the books that they signed on for, and I was just like, oh man, are they really gonna like give this one the axe after putting that much work into it? But no, it's going to happen. So I'm really excited about that. And if you're a Merle Travis fan, I'm a Merle Travis fan. I think there's a lot of us that are just, you want to know the story because here's a guy that's a country music Hall of Fame artist, a guy who owned this style of thumb picking, and such an influential guy, wrote these songs that everybody knows. And there's no book on him. It made no sense. I mean, you can buy a book on everybody,
Right.
Skeeter Davis, Bill Anderson, you name it. They've all got books out, but there was no Merle Travis book. So that was kind of my thing, is I just kind of wanted to change that.
So was that literally the catalyst? You maybe looked one day and said, there's no book here and I want to do this? Or did someone maybe approach you? Or how does that work?
A lot of my career choices, if you want to call it that, have been based on me thinking that hasn't been done before. Somebody needs to do that.
Okay.
My Guitar Geek Festival that I did, and writing this Merle Travis book and several other things that I've done have just been because, like, man, somebody ought to do that. I guess I should, And Merle Travis seemed particularly, I mean, it was galling to me that there was no book.
Sure.
Because he was such a major figure and an interesting guy. And when I started writing the book, it was like, I'm not sure I'm going to have enough, material for the book. Because this is a guy who died in 1983. Everybody he knew is dead, And then I worked with his 2 living daughters, Merlene and Cindy, who live out in California. And when they let me into the storage unit, all of a sudden there was, tens of thousands of pictures and letters and correspondence and memorabilia and, reel-to-reel tapes and, guitars, Western suits. I mean, it was incredible. So then all of a sudden it was like, okay, now I have way too much. And, the book actually had to be edited down quite a bit, but I think it's going to be...
You've got close to 500 pages, according to the promotional material.
It's over 500 pages,
wow.
I think.
Yeah.
Including all the footnotes and everything.
Jeez. Yeah, my heart just fluttered when you said there's a storage unit full of Merle Travis memorabilia. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So can you sort of walk us through the process of writing a book like that? Sorry, go ahead.
No, you finish your question.
Well, I was just going to say, because as someone who's followed your work over the years, both your articles for the magazines as well as... you've had, correct me if I'm wrong, 2 previous books, but of a different style. Mm-hmm. The Strat in the Attic, Volume 1 and 2. Mm-hmm. Your writing style to me so far is something that seems very conversational, very...
That's how I write.
Yeah.
Just like I was talking,
Well, it's wonderful. And I was just wondering if that was something that you had to adapt in, doing a long form biography. Do you have to put more of the professorial hat on with this, or can we expect something that's going to be maybe more attainable, graspable for everybody, and conversational in your style?
Well, it's a very good question, and these other two books that I wrote were basically a collection of short stories,
Yes.
And the publisher approached me. They wanted me to write this book, and they had a title for it already, Strat in the Attic. And so it was just like, we just want there to be stories about people finding rare and vintage and valuable guitars out in the wild. And so it was fun because every story was 4 pages or less, It was just a collection of short stories. Writing a biography is a completely different animal, especially writing a biography for like a real publisher like BMG Books, because there's just a much higher bar to get up to. So the other thing that made it quite challenging, but also very interesting, is that we found about 100 pages of raw, unedited autobiographical writing that Merle had done. Like he had kind of started to write an autobiography, and he did a ton of writing over the years. He wrote articles for Guitar World, and he wrote articles in country music magazines back in the 60s and stuff. But he was a bad alcoholic. He was a drunk. And so everything was really disorganized. And so my task when I got hold of this stuff was, okay, this is all really good information. How do we fit this into the book? And it's a wee bit confusing because all of his autobiographical writing stops at the year 1955. Even if he was writing it in the 60s or 70s, like there's nothing written about himself after 1955. So the first half of the book contains these chapters by Merle, followed by a chapter by me talking about his first chapter. Up until 1955, then it's all me. Then I just take the whole rest of his life. And that was a weird bit of an adaptation that we had to do, but that was what we had to work with. So,
Sure. So I've got so many questions about this Merle Travis project, and I won't go too much into it because obviously we want people to buy the book and
Sure.
all of that. But one thing that I've always heard about Merle Travis is he was able to tell quite the story, and he spun some yarns.
Mm-hmm.
How much of the stuff that you've been able to track down in his writings and other places, how much of this project has been fact checking, and how are you able to fact check someone who passed away in the 80s, and as you said earlier, a lot of the connections or contacts that he had have also left us?
Well, so it's kind of an involved question because, I did about, 70 or 80 interviews for the book. And then I pulled from about 50 other interviews that the Country Music Hall of Fame had and things like that. And then tons of resource materials like, newspaper articles, magazine articles, so on and so forth. And then once you have what you have pulled from those and put it in your book, then you have to fact check it. And most of it, actually, you'd be surprised, you can fact check things, even things that you think are really obscure from the 1930s. You can go online and find out oh yeah, well the Knox County Knockabouts, they actually did start playing in 1936, just like Merle said. But then other things like Merle would tell this story of how he left Kentucky to go for his first professional road gig with Clayton McMitchen, and he would give differing dates. One interview he said it was January 1937. One interview he said it was February 1937, and in each time that he told the interview, he would talk about this big flood that happened. So then I would just double check. Okay, well, when did this big flood happen? In the river, going through Evansville. Oh, that happened the second week of February. So it must have happened, right around then. And that's kind of how I did it. Man, it was so much work. I can't even tell you. But you'd be surprised. I mean, almost everything could actually be fact checked, and certain things. Even if they sounded like just complete malarkey that he had made up, no, man, they turned out to be true,
Wow. Well, So what you just described, this process is being very time consuming. It makes me wonder, there's 24 hours in a day.
Yeah.
You're still a working, performing musician, recording musician. How do you find time to do all of these, different, because you're not just writing that book,
Right.
or you weren't just writing that book. You also put very wonderful articles up on your website pretty regularly. You write for different, periodicals, and just, you do a lot. How?
Well, the funny thing about the Merle Travis book is in 2018, once I had the contract, I actually set aside, I think it was 3 months or something like that. I flew out to Kentucky and drove around to Arkansas and Cincinnati and Kentucky and Nashville and Mississippi, all these places, that had people I wanted to interview for the book or that Merle had, worked in. And then I spent some time writing, getting all that stuff kind of organized. But then after that, it was always a real fight to find some time to work on it. And then when I finally had this deadline from the publisher, it was like right when COVID happened. And all of a sudden, my gigs were
All of a
down.
sudden you had time.
Yeah. So literally for the first 3 months of, from March until May of 2020, I just sat down and I just finished the book basically. And then after I did that first draft, we've been working on revisions, and the first one I turned in was too long. It probably would have been about 700 pages. And
I would read that. I would read that.
Well, after the book comes out, I'll send you the long version if you want to see it.
Please, yeah.
And there's a lot of people that I had read the book to make sure that I got everything right. Like Eddie Pennington, if you know him.
I do. Yeah.
Eddie knows more about Merle Travis than any other person.
That's probably a fair, yeah.
Completely obscure biographical detail, and I was surprised at how much Eddie. He would throw in little things like, when Merle recorded Too Much Sugar for a Dime, they sent out these little promotional sacks of sugar and a dime taped to a postcard, and things that only he knew.
Please tell me you found one of those somewhere in that storage locker.
Well, his daughters have one of the cards with a dime attached to it, but no sugar. No sugar.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's better than nothing.
It did, but it proved that Eddie was right.
Yeah. Side note, for anybody who's not familiar with Eddie, check him out. He is a fantastic thumb style player in his own right.
Yeah. Princeton, Kentucky.
Mm-hmm. And plays Merle Travis closer to the way Travis played it than probably almost anybody.
Yeah.
So.
Well, him and Bresh.
Yeah.
And Eddie Pennington goes on and on about this guy named Bobby Barber, who's passed on now, who was from Georgia, that he said was the best. He said nobody could touch that guy. And if Eddie says that, it's got to be true.
Wow, yeah. Well, I'm going to be doing some Googling tonight.
There you go. I'm not sure if he really recorded much, but,
Okay.
And I think he died in the 80s, a long time ago. But anyway, it was nice to have people like that I could send a copy to the book to and say, what's wrong. And
absolutely.
There was a guy in England who knows more about hillbilly music than anybody in the world, and he was able to fact check a few things, and then I sent it to the person that does my website, and she edits art magazines and does all that kind of thing from a very academic standpoint. So she was actually able to. So I feel like we kind of got it looked at from a whole bunch of different angles to make sure that it was proper.
That's impressive. You keep touching on this a little bit, and it's something that I was planning on asking towards the end of the interview in a different area, but we keep kind of touching on it, and so I think it's just worth asking in this segment here. In your adult life, so let's say 90s on, we have seen, or even 80s, we've seen and lost a large number of the folks who I think we can cite as creating American music and what we know it is today. And you were around when a lot of those guys were still around and picking, and you've sort of seen the numbers wane. And I was just wondering from not just a guitar player perspective, because of course we all love these people, but also, sort of a music historian and all of the other things that you do with trying to preserve what it is that we call roots music, country music, Americana, jazz, blues, all of it. How does that change the way you have to approach projects like this?
Well, I'll just tell you one thing, this Merle Travis thing, a lot of his contemporaries died a very long time ago. He died in 1983. A lot of the people that should have been interviewed for the book died in the late 80s or early 90s. I was able to, pull interview quotes from other things just to make sure that they were present in the book. But then, like I told you, I got the book contract in 2018, and I immediately went out and interviewed 7 or 8 people that were in their 90s, that knew Merle. His best friend, Jack Rogers, who lived in Ohio, Rosalie Maphis, who lived in Nashville, Herb Remington, who he played with in 1944 in Los Angeles, and a few others. And every single one of them is dead now. So it's like I got them on tape, just like a year or 2 or less before they died. Going forth, I mean, obviously people are writing books about music that happened in the 1920s, and every single person involved is dead. So it's still possible.
Sure.
But I just really love meeting with old timers and just, getting them to tell their stories before they're gone. And it sort of breaks my heart when somebody passes on that never really adequately got interviewed.
Sure. So I'm going to ask this from a very selfish point of view because I started doing these interviews about 1.5 years ago. And please don't name any names, but have you ever had a don't meet your heroes moment? And how do you handle that, if so?
Oh, absolutely. Some of your heroes turn out to be the greatest people in the whole world, and they remember your name, and they're always happy to see you, and they get you up on stage to play with them, and all that kind of stuff. And then others just turn out to be just complete jerks, And I think it's just human nature, One thing that, for me, when you're writing about these old timers, you have to be aware, like, okay, if they were playing music in the 1930s and the 1940s and the 1950s and the 1960s, like, man, there's a lot of racism, there's a lot of sexism, there's a lot of stuff that just is absolutely, completely unacceptable in the academic world of today. So you have to be able to separate the art from the artist, And I think for a lot of people that's difficult, like Uncle Dave Macon, fantastic performer. Did a bunch of songs with the N-word in the title, He's still a great performer. You have to separate the art from the artist, and you have to recognize that things were just very different in the old days. You don't whitewash over it, and certainly in the Merle Travis book, I don't whitewash the difficult stuff that he went through with alcohol. I think it's important to talk about it, but at the same time, like it's difficult to thread that needle. Because, some of these performers, let's just say Uncle Dave Macon, the guy was a groundbreaker. I mean, he was a fantastic musician, entertainer, recording artist. But, a lot of these subject matters that he sang about are completely taboo now.
Sure. So you kind of already answered this, but the separating the art from the artist, You've never walked away from an encounter like that and struggled to listen to that person's music the same way?
Well,
again, no names.
Yeah, no. There's a few I could name where I just loved their music so much before I had an encounter with them, and then after I had a really bad encounter with them, like you just can't help but think about that time, Yeah. And it's unfortunate because. I think the music is, supposed to be something that spreads happiness and joy and cheer and makes people feel good. And so when you meet somebody who's just bitter and angry and treats their fans like dirt, you're like, wow, what a horrible world that person must live in.
Yeah. Well, getting back on track a little
Sure.
bit, thank you for answering that so candidly, by the way. But I wanted to kind of shift a little bit now again and talk about you as the Strat in the Attic stories, and we'll get to this story, and just sort of the travel that you do, and the collecting of stories, and the collecting of interesting guitars, and different pieces of memorabilia. Is that something that you do as part of an ongoing, I'm building a collection for this specific purpose, or is it just something inside of you? I guess to phrase it a little bit better, because I'm giving you a word salad right now. Is there a purpose in terms of the business side of things where it's, I'm going to collect this because this is going to be worth X amount of dollars, or is it literally just something internally that drives you to want to meet the people that you meet and collect the things that you do, and make this sort of thing that you have as the person you are?
Well, it's most definitely the latter, where I just have always kind of been obsessive compulsive about the things that I liked,
Sure.
When I was a little kid, they thought I was hyperactive, and they actually put me on some, Ritalin or something like that, and then I just kind of laid around with drool coming out of my mouth, and then my mom figured out, like, no, if he's actually interested in something, he'll sit there and he'll play with it real intently for hours on hours. It's just like when he doesn't have any focus, then he's just hyperactive, That's been the story of my life. So things that I get interested in, whether it's music history or guitars or recording equipment or whatever it is, I mean, I never get into it a little bit. It's always like a deep dive, and the next thing you know, I'm knee deep in some guy's barn, digging through stacks of crap, and
Literal barn, guys. Literal.
Yeah, literal barn. So that's just been the story of my life, and to me, it's always just pursuing what I think is interesting. And when I was going on the road, I quickly realized that it's really boring on the road if you don't find something to occupy your time. And so for me, it's always like, well, I'm gonna go to guitar stores while I'm here, or I'm gonna go to museums, or I'm gonna try to track down this guy. And like I'm here in Atlanta this week, and I've been trying to figure out a way to meet J.W. Brown, who was Jerry Lee Lewis's bass player in 1957 and 1958 when he first started touring. And he's still alive. He's 95 years old here in Atlanta. And he was also the father of Myra Lewis, who married Jerry Lee when she was 13. I don't know if you know that story.
I know that story, yes.
So Myra's here in Atlanta too, and man, I want to meet JW so bad. And I called him today, and his wife sort of nixed the whole idea,
Wow.
Yeah, it broke my heart, because it's like, oh man, he's 95. But yeah, that's just always been the thing that I wanted to do instead of just laying around and doing nothing.
Well, so let's kind of break that down a little bit.
Well, and I was going to say, I was just having a conversation. I was telling the J.W. Brown story to my friend Jim Harrington, who's a fantastic photographer from Nashville. And he brought up, well, you're trying to build the Deke Dickerson brand. And I was just like, come on, man. The brand is worth nothing. I mean, this is just strictly for my own entertainment. Like there's nothing marketable about the Deke Dickerson brand. It's just things that I want to check off my own personal bucket list.
Well, respectfully, I'm going to disagree with you a little bit there, because there are those of us out there who really, I feel like maybe silently or not so silently, are in your corner and rooting for you to do these things and following what you're doing. And I would say that, this whole conversation adds up to maybe that being your brand, is you're the guy that a lot of us guitar players who love this music are rooting for.
I hear that a lot, guys that, working for some insurance company, they're like, oh man, I live vicariously through your adventures. And I appreciate that. I mean, I really, really do. But at the end of the day, it's like my dad used to tell me, like, well, that and 50 cents will get you a cup of coffee,
Well, not anymore, but yeah.
Exactly, yeah. That and $2.30 will get you a cup of coffee.
Well,
but no, I do appreciate it. I don't mean to sound like
No.
It's funny how it just kind of worked out that way. Like, I had a day job and I hated it so much that I just said, I don't care what I have to do. I just am not going to work a day job anymore.
Well, I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but what was that day job?
I had a bunch.
Okay.
I worked at a gas station when I first moved out to California. I worked at a record store, worked for a T-shirt screen printing business. And then, man, I thought I had found, because I'm from Missouri, and I had a series of pretty menial, hard labor jobs in Missouri. And then I finally got this job in California working for a self-help company. And I was like the guy in the back who like printed up their books and did their mail order and stuff. And it paid, it paid a lot of money back in the 90s, I was making $20 an hour. And anytime that we had to exert any sort of physical exertion, they'd say, you should lay down for half an hour and rest. I'm like, dude, I used to, bale hay and stuff. Like, what are you talking about? But it was just the greatest job ever. And I would still play music, on the weekends and kind of sneak in these 3-day weekends and 4-day weekends. And I did it so much that they eventually fired me. And from that day forward, it was like, that's it. I'm not working any more day jobs.
Wow. Well, getting back on track a little bit.
The self-help. I should write a book about working for the self-help company. It was hilarious.
You should write a book about making books for self-help.
Yeah.
I like that.
Well, of course, I used full advantage of their copier to make, gig flyers and things like that.
Who wouldn't?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, so, we were talking about you traveling around and kind of collecting stories and meeting these individuals. And, one of the things that I know that you do, and you occasionally post about it, or you occasionally have things that you write articles about, you always manage to find these really interesting instruments in places that I think in 2022 we sometimes think, oh, they're all gone, they're all found, they're all, the Antique Roadshow changed everything because now everyone thinks they've got something valuable, but you seem to continuously find the Strat in the attic or the barn finds or whatever we want to call them. How?
Well, and the vintage guitar thing is largely a baby boomer thing, and I'm younger than that. I'm a Generation X guy. And so the baby boomers guys that got into it early on in the 60s or 70s, they were the guys that were able to buy pre-CBS Stratocasters for $100 and things like that. I was never able to do that.
Sure.
By the time that I developed an interest in vintage instruments, they were too expensive for me to buy, And so I immediately became drawn to the weird guitar in the very back of the store, what's that? A Supro or, that Dan Electro, and those were kind of the only cheap things you could buy when I was coming up. And then when I moved to California, that was a real eye-opener because then all of a sudden this whole world of Mosrite, Standell, Bigsby, Murph, there's just all these weird brands that were floating around and you could still find those things. And so it kind of in the pre-eBay years of the 1990s, I found a whole bunch of those guitars super cheap. And then as I played them at gigs, people started thinking of me as the weird guitar guy. And then now it's hilarious because, if some orphan triple neck guitar with, corncob headstocks and what it shows up on eBay, or like I get 10 emails about it. Oh, you got to check this out. Like the stuff literally just, flows in my direction. And a lot of these things, I'm the only guy that has any interest at all, especially some of these hillbilly handmade instruments. It's like, oh man, I wouldn't have that in my collection if you paid me, but Deke Dickerson will give you a few $100 for it, So that's just kind of how it's turned out the last few years.
Sure.
And I'd find them interesting as objects of art. If whether it's a beautiful old Gibson or something that some guy made very crudely with hand tools in his shed, I always find it really interesting to think about. Well, look how they did this. Look how they designed that, and they got this from this and they got that from that and they took those influences and made this thing. So for me it's more like, I don't know, like a visual stimulation that you can also play music on.
Sure. Well, I think that maybe leads us. I came in here and you showed me this, and I want to I think that this is maybe a good way to highlight what it is that you do. When you're on the road and you find something interesting, and maybe
Sure.
you can just tell us the story very quickly.
Well, I'm
What
not a
happened
blues
here.
guitar player, but
Sure.
you want to
me
hold this for a
Sure,
second?
absolutely, with pleasure.
A lot of blues guitar players play these harmony Stratotones, and they're really interesting guitars because they're neck through. Some of them are made out of one piece of wood, like the whole thing. This one's made out of neck through, but then it has some sides sort of glued on. But they sustain like crazy, and they sound great. They're so good, and they started out as harmony's most basic instrument, like the bottom of the line. And so, I remember when they were a couple $100, but then now you look on eBay and Reverb, and people are asking $2,000 or $3,000 for them. And
Wow.
there's several well-known blues players that use them exclusively. And I never got one when they were cheap. So I was here in my room looking at the local Atlanta Craigslist, and this thing popped up, and a guy was asking $700 for it. I thought it was kind of high, and I drove out to meet him this morning. He was way north of town, out in Buford.
Okay, yeah.
And man, it was a real sketchy situation, man. It was like 3 people living in this studio apartment about the size of this room, and it was like just bad stuff going on in there, and this guy had this guitar that he obviously had been trying to sell it for some time with no takers, and I looked at it and I was like, well, all the finish has been stripped off of it. I'm not interested. And he was like, well, what do you give me for it? And I said, well, I'll give you $400 for it, I guess. And he was like, sure. He was just as happy as a clam. And so, yeah, I got a perfectly playable stripped harmony Stratotone for $400. That's about as good as you can do in 2022.
I'd say so. Is this the Richie Valens guitar?
Yeah, although this is a harmony Stratotone Newport,
Okay.
which was kind of the lower model, and it just has this. It almost looks like an acoustic guitar bridge tailpiece thing in it. The one that he played was the higher model that had a sort of adjustable bridge and a trapeze tailpiece. But I think the blues guys like them both.
Hey, right. Well,
and just wrap your hand around this neck.
that is a baseball bat.
Yeah, you can't do Merle Travis on that neck.
No.
Because it's literally whittled out of one piece of wood.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Well, I'm sure you'll clean it up and get it strung properly up top there, and
Yeah.
I'll pass this back to you. Well, I think, we're coming to the end a little bit, and I just wanted to ask you if you had any advice for younger generations who, I always say want to follow in your footsteps. Your footsteps are so unique, but, maybe want to do something like what you do or want to have a career in this area of music and in today's market. What would you tell someone who has a passion for this type of music and wants to do something with it?
So the main thing is that nobody should try to be me, because I'm the only me, and it's not that profitable. There's definitely not a market out there for 2 of us. I think that the main thing is, if you have a calling, if something just moves you that much, then you just got to follow that. And if you do it well enough and you do it long enough, you're going to have some fans. You're going to have some people who will buy what you put out and support you. We have to be realistic that some things are not going to support you enough to keep you from having a day job. Other things, I've been shocked at some of my friends that have gone on to these fantastic careers, like my friend J.D. McPherson used to open up for me when I played in Oklahoma. He had a little band there. And now I hear his music being played in the supermarket when I go there. And, so you just have to follow your own path and sort of not deviate from what you think you should be doing in your head. Now, of course, that's not what people in the music business would tell you, because the interesting thing to me is that a lot of these people that we think are so successful and cool and whatever, they have all these handlers, who pick out what clothes they're going to wear and who do their hair. And And then the record label tells them like they can't say certain things and all that. And it's like, man, I wouldn't want to live like that. That's like being somebody's slave, you know?
Yeah.
The nice thing about being an independent, do-it-yourself kind of person is you can just do whatever the hell you want. And do it your whole life, you know? And so that for me is the greatest, what's the word I'm looking for? You know, the thing that really makes me proud is that, man, I just came up with a wacky idea and I did it all myself, and somehow or another I've made it float.
That's fantastic. This has been wonderful, and I just want to say thank you, not just for doing this interview, but just thank you for doing what you do for the guitar community and for the people, including myself, who love this type of music, and keeping it alive in the way that you do, and keeping it continuing to find new ways to provide us with more and more content like the Merle Travis book. And just from the bottom of my heart, thank you for doing this.
You got it, man. Well, it's obviously something that I enjoy doing, so I'm just happy that somebody out there is appreciating it.
Would you mind picking us something?
Sure.
Cool.
Well, I'm going to do a Merle Travis song since I wrote this book about Merle Travis, but I am not a Travis picker. I am not a thumb picker. I'm going to do it with a flat pick, which is, that's really wrong, but I'm going to do it anyway. One of my favorite sort of underappreciated songs that Travis did was one called Turn My Picture Upside Down. So I'm going to do that one for you. Turn my picture upside down, face it towards the wall. Good gal, I just found out you don't love me at all. Even though I feel so sad to think that I will fall. Turn my picture upside down, face it towards the wall. No more sorrow on the morrow. What's good for you is good for one and all. Before you break another heart, do one thing before you start. Turn my picture upside down, face it towards the wall. Interrupt this because one of my favorite Travis turnarounds, if you got to do something over a four diminished 1 6 2 5 1 kind of thing, this is the lick he came up with. Now I can do just the same as you now that we're not bound. Good gal, just to watch my smoke, I'm really going to town. And even though I feel so sad to think that I will fall, to think of my poor picture facing towards the wall. Though you're leaving, I'm not grieving. Get out upon your hands and knees and crawl. Before you break another heart, do one thing before you start. Turn my picture upside down, face it towards the wall.